Okay, we are diving straight into a massive intellectual controversy today. We're unpacking the highly debated methodological conversion of apologist Cameron Bertuzzi to Roman Catholicism. But listen, we aren't just telling a story today. We are looking strictly at the data, the source material, and the really intense critiques surrounding his entire methodology. Basically, we are looking at why Cameron Bertuzzi is wrong, according to his critics, and having his fatal errors exposed. The sources we're examining offer this razor-sharp cross-examination of his arguments, pointing out what Protestant apologists and historical critics identify as massive structural and methodological missteps. Whether you agree with his ultimate conclusions or not, the way he got there is a masterclass in modern theological debate, and honestly, analyzing the pushback is just as educational.
So, can you mathematically calculate your way to a new religion? It sounds almost like a paradox, doesn't it? I mean, when we think of theology, we usually think of qualitative things, right? Faith, historical context, scriptural interpretation. But the sources highlight a really profound tension here. Bertuzzi literally attempted to bridge the gap between qualitative theology and quantitative math. He tried to run historical claims through a mathematical formula to spit out an objective truth. But as we'll see, mixing hard numbers with subjective historical interpretation creates a highly volatile equation.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at Bertuzzi's core arguments. Then, we're going to systematically walk through the cross-examination, breaking down 4 fatal errors: Bayesian abuse, forced biblical typology, historical anachronisms, and finally, what critics call the package deal.
Part 1. The core arguments, Cameron's case for Rome.
Before you can effectively critique a methodology, you really have to understand the specific intellectual steps that led to the conclusion. I mean, Bertuzzi didn't just wake up one day and switch traditions out of nowhere. He built a very specific framework. Step 1 was establishing a Bayesian probability framework. He weighed roughly 15 Protestant objections against positive Catholic arguments. And according to his math, he concluded there was a 90% plus probability that Catholicism was true. Step 2 was his absolute most decisive theological argument: typology. He argued that Matthew 16 directly echoes Isaiah 22, where this figure named Eliakim is made a prime minister with the keys. Bertuzzi argued Peter is the new Eliakim, inheriting a perpetual papal office. Step 3 was his negation rule. He figured that if this specific setup is true, you won't find it in Protestantism, which heavily skewed his math toward Rome. And finally, step 4, he systematically removed his own philosophical barriers. He found that Catholicism could actually accommodate his personal, niche views on concepts like divine simplicity and annihilationism. By clearing out those specific intellectual hurdles, the papacy became his one and only deciding filter.
Let's move to Part 2. Error 1. Bayesian abuse, or the math problem. This brings us to the very first major critique from the historical and theological sources regarding that mathematical model. They argue that applying an equation to history creates a massive blind spot. To understand the critique, we kind of need to understand the tool. Bayesian probability is a mathematical theorem, but here is the massive catch. It relies entirely on what are called priors. Priors are just the subjective probability numbers that an individual assigns to an event before running the formula. Actually, it's kind of like deciding there's an 80% chance of rain just because your knee hurts and then running that through a supercomputer to sound scientific. The critics point out that applying this hard mathematical formula to qualitative, historical claims creates a totally false illusion of scientific objectivity. Sure, you might be using hard math, but the numbers you feed into that math, they're completely subjective.
So the sources highlight a really critical tension here: subjective bias versus objective proof. They argue Bertuzzi arbitrarily assigned super high probability values to a single, highly contested interpretation of Matthew 16, while simultaneously minimizing the weight of 15 major historical objections. When you do that, the system's output isn't some hard, objective proof. It's simply an output dictated by the bias of the person who inputted the numbers in the first place. Treating qualitative theological interpretations like they are hard data points fundamentally misrepresents how historical and textual evaluation actually works.
All right, on to Part 3. Error 2. Forced biblical typology, which is basically misreading Isaiah 22.
Now, this addresses what Bertuzzi considered his single most decisive argument. The critics argue he completely forced the Eliakim typology from Isaiah 22 onto the Apostle Peter just to construct a fully functioning papal office with perpetual successors. The sources brilliantly refute this by looking at the text itself. First, look at Eliakim in Isaiah 22. Bertuzzi uses him as the model for an infallible perpetual papal office. But the text in Isaiah actually ends with Eliakim snapping like a peg and falling. There's literally no mechanism for perpetual succession there.
Second, the sources point out that Revelation 3:7 explicitly names Christ, not Peter, as the ultimate fulfillment who holds the key of David. And third, look at the apostles as a whole group. Over in Matthew 18 and John 20, the exact same authority to bind and loose is given to all the apostles. That implies a shared authority rather than a single exclusive papal office. Critics argue the typology simply cannot bear the massive weight Bertuzzi places on it.
Moving to Part 4. Error 3. Historical anachronisms, or rewriting the early church.
The historical critique gets right to the heart of the matter. For Bertuzzi's model to work, you have to accept that a monarchical papacy with universal jurisdiction existed from the very beginning. But the sources note that top modern scholars, and we're talking about prominent Catholic historians here like Raymond Brown and Eamon Duffy, freely acknowledge that the early church in Rome was actually governed by a plurality of presbyters and bishops. Documents from the 1st and 2nd centuries, like 1 Clement and the Shepherd of Hermas, clearly reflect collegiate leadership. So critics argue that to trace a single supreme papal office directly back to the 1st century requires a massive anachronism. It requires taking the dogmas defined in the 19th century at Vatican I and reading them backward into a 1st century history where they literally just do not appear.
And finally, Part 5. Error 4. The package deal. Swallowing the camel.
The sources describe this final error as just a massive logical leap. It shows the sheer danger of using a single testing filter to accept an incredibly complex dogmatic system. Bertuzzi treated the papacy as this ultimate master key metric. His reasoning was that if he could get the mathematical probability of the papacy above just 50%, literally just a simple majority, he would then embrace Catholicism entirely. He essentially decided that if this one specific domino fell, every other domino had to fall right along with it, regardless of their individual scriptural merits.
By isolating the papacy as his sole metric, Bertuzzi committed to a package deal. He had to swallow massive theological concepts whole: the Marian dogmas like the Immaculate Conception and the bodily Assumption, the doctrine of purgatory, the anathematizing of sola fide, justification by faith alone, and all the sweeping decrees of the Council of Trent. The critics argue this is a fatal flaw because it forces the acceptance of all these doctrines without independent scriptural evaluation against texts like Romans and Galatians. You end up accepting an entire mountain of theology just because your subjective math equation tipped to 51% on a completely different historical question. This absolutely matters because it exposes the danger of using a single historical loophole to bypass the independent evaluation of massive, life-altering doctrines.
Which leaves us with this final, really profound question to consider. Does isolating one metric actually validate an entire theological system? The sources we explored in this explainer strongly argue no. They point to the real dangers of subjective math, forced biblical typology, historical anachronisms, and the massive logical leaps of a package deal. It forces us to deeply ponder the structural soundness of how we evaluate truth claims. I mean, can we really reduce thousands of years of historical and theological nuance down to a single probability score? It is an absolutely fascinating debate, and I hope this provided a clear, structured understanding of the fatal errors exposed by his critics. Thanks for learning with me today, and definitely keep asking those deep questions.